The first time Ethan Cole saw her again, she was lit up by television cameras and applause, standing under a blown-up American flag in a high school gym. Senatorial candidate Nora Hale, the golden daughter of Ohio politics, had the whole room eating out of her hand. Then her eyes slid past the crowd, landed on the man in the faded maintenance polo by the back doors, and everything in her face broke. Her voice caught on a word. The microphone squealed. Reporters leaned forward as if they could smell blood. Ethan froze, mop handle still in his hand, heart pounding loud enough to drown out the chants of her name. For 10 years, he'd been a ghost in her world, the man she'd let take the fall so her future could stay clean. Now she was staring at him like he'd come back from the dead. The audience began to murmur. Cameras swung around, hunting for the cause of her sudden silence. Nora stepped away from the podium on shaking legs, the crowd's cheers turning into confused chatter. She came straight off the stage, straight through the aisle of folding chairs, right toward him. "Ethan," she whispered when she reached him, her perfectly rehearsed voice frayed and raw. "I never told them what I did to you. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world." 2 months before that moment, Ethan Cole was just the night guy. 37 years old, divorced former somebody, now the man who waxed the floors at the Lake Erie Civic Center in Sandusky, Ohio. He clocked in at 4 p.m., clocked out at midnight, and in between, he pushed carts of cleaning supplies past bulletin boards, full of other people's big events, job fairs, concerts, political rallies he'd never attend as anything but staff. By day, he lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with his father, a retired steel worker whose legs didn't work like they used to, and whose pride wouldn't let him admit how much he needed his son. Ethan made coffee-sorted pills into day-of-the-week boxes and pretended it didn't gut him that his dad still introduced him to neighbors as my boy, the engineer, like the state license they'd taken away a decade ago, was just out getting polished. Most nights, the building was quiet enough for his thoughts to echo. About the bridge that collapsed, the investigation that followed, the way the newspapers had printed his name in bold when they needed someone to blame, and how one statement from Nora Hale, then a young city councilwoman with a famous last name, had tilted everything. "We trust the findings," she'd said, into a bank of microphones standing beside her real estate developer father. "We support accountability." He'd watched that clip 100 times, knowing exactly which design change he'd refused, exactly who had pushed it through anyway, and exactly why he'd signed the settlement papers that made it all his fault. A clean fall guy buys a lot of campaign donations. He told himself he'd moved on, that fixing leaky toilets and jammed doors was honest work, that taking care of his dad mattered more than clearing his own name. But some nights alone in the echoing halls, he'd still see the way Nora used to look at him, back when they were just 2 broke kids with big plans before her last name, and his conscience had torn them apart. On a gray Tuesday in late October, he was stripping old tape off the lobby floor when the events coordinator marched in with a clipboard and a smile too bright to be real. "Big news, Ethan," she said, slapping a glossy poster up on the bulletin board. "We just landed the hail for Senate Town Hall. National press. Whole circus. You're gonna hate it." He glanced up out of habit, ready to nod and go back to work. And there she was on the poster, Nora Hale, hair shorter, now, smile sharper, tagline in bold letters underneath "A new bridge to tomorrow." The mop bucket sloshed against his leg. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt something he'd buried deep under routine and resignation. Not anger. Not yet. Just the cold, clear knowledge that the past he'd taken the blame for was walking right back into his building, live on national TV. Ethan wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the town hall once the campaign rolled in. By contract, maintenance staff cleaned before setup, then disappeared until after the media cleared out. But the Hail for Senate team arrived early, frantic, demanding more help. The event's coordinator flagged him down with the same cheerful misery she used when announcing plumbing disasters. "Ethan, they want the risers moved again, and they're complaining the lighting is making her look too tired." She added air quotes. Their words. He didn't argue. He never did. He grabbed the dolly, rolled out the folding platform, and started rearranging what he'd already rearranged twice. The campaign team swarmed the gym like they owned it. Clipboards, perfect hair, sharp voices cutting through the air. Each time they passed him, their eyes slid over him like he was part of the wall. One of them, a young guy with a Bluetooth earpiece, and the kind of confidence only inherited money buys, stopped in front of Ethan and pointed without looking at him. "That needs to be centered. It's crooked. Also, can someone tell maintenance we don't want water jugs visible on camera? And these chairs, they creak. We can't have that." Ethan didn't bother telling him he was maintenance. No one listened to those corrections anyway. Instead, he moved the riser again, shifted the chairs again, and tucked the water jugs into the supply closet. By the time he finished, a sheen of sweat was on his forehead. The earpiece guy walked past, glanced at the work, and said flatly, "Try not to scuff the floor." Ethan stared at the man's back. He'd built real bridges once, literal load-bearing structures, the kind that held families and commuters and whole towns together. The kind that could save lives or ruin them when politics meddled with engineering. Now he was being lectured about scuff marks by someone who didn't know the difference between rebar and drywall. He turned back to the riser and tightened the last bolt. Pride didn't get to live in his life anymore. Just routine. When he stepped into the hallway to grab the caution signs, he heard her voice. Nora. It carried the way it always had during debates and press interviews, polished, warm, built to persuade. She was practicing with her communications director, going through lines he knew were written 3 levels above her. He couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. She was preparing to be admired, preparing to win. He forced himself not to look. He was bending to pick up a sign when something heavy thudded into his cart. A backpack. A teenage girl stood there. Dark hair in 2 quick braids, red knit hat pulled low. She looked about 15, maybe 16, tall, like she'd grown too fast that year. "Are you Ethan?" she asked. He blinked. "Yeah." She offered her hand, awkward but determined. "I'm Lily. Lily." He recognized the name. The daughter of his next-door neighbor, a widowed nurse who worked double shifts at the county hospital. Lily sometimes helped him carry groceries up the stairs for his dad. She was the kind of kid who apologized every time she existed in someone's way. He shook her hand. "What are you doing in here? I volunteer with the youth panel," she said, holding up a laminated badge. "They said I should deliver these pamphlets, but the Hale team yelled at me for being in the wrong zone. Then they yelled at me for asking where the right zone was." She kicked the floor lightly. "I thought adults were supposed to have patience." Ethan tried to smile. "You'd be surprised." She hesitated. "Mom told me you used to be an engineer." "It's cool you're helping run events now." "Helping," he echoed. "Right." She watched him for a moment with those sharp, too old eyes some kids develop when life makes them grow up early. "They shouldn't talk to you like that. It's fine. It's not." He didn't know how to answer, so he didn't. He just handed her a dolly of programs and showed her which hallway to drop them in. When she left, she paused and said quietly, "I know what it feels like when people only see the job you're doing instead of the person you are." He swallowed hard. "You're a good kid, Lily," she grinned. "I'm tough. People just forget." When she disappeared around the corner, Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. By noon, the building transformed from a civic center into a political battleground. Local news trucks lined the street. Volunteers set up sign-in booths. Armed security appeared at every exit. Everyone seemed fueled by adrenaline and caffeine, moving with speed and purpose. Everyone but Ethan, who moved with caution, slow enough not to upset anyone, quick enough not to look like a problem. At 2 o'clock, the campaign team called an emergency walkthrough. He joined the back of the group without thinking, habit from years of building things where everyone's presence mattered. Halfway through the inspection, one of the consultants turned and noticed him. "You," she snapped. "Why are you standing here?" Ethan straightened. "I'm maintenance. I'm making sure—" She cut him off with a raised hand, as if swatting away a fly. "Not during internal run-throughs. Staff needs to wait outside. Please don't make this awkward." Laughter bubbled up behind her from other volunteers. He stepped back, nodding, but his ears burned. He felt like he was 17 again. The kid whose father dropped him at school in a truck that coughed louder than the morning bell. The kid whose best plans could be erased by someone with sharper clothes or better timing. He turned toward the hallway and ran straight into Nora. She'd been looking down at her tablet, deep in thought, but when she saw him, her entire expression trembled. It was barely a flicker, a tightening of her hand, a catch in her breath, but he saw it. She stepped aside, letting the consultant barrel past them without acknowledging either of them. Then it was just the two of them in the doorway. Nora looked at him like she wanted to say something. 100 somethings. Apology, memory, fear, recognition. But her communications director shouted her name, and the spell shattered. She dipped her head and walked past him, spine-straight expression returning to the armor she wore on TV. He watched her go. 10 years collapsed into a single silent moment. And the wound he'd buried alongside his license and his pride flickered awake. Around 5, Ethan got a call from the care home. His father had tried to get out of bed without his walker and taken a minor fall. He wasn't badly hurt, the nurse assured him, just shaken. But they needed someone to pick him up tomorrow for a doctor's check-in. "I'll be there," Ethan promised. When he hung up, he closed his eyes. His father hated being reminded he needed help. If he found out Ethan was working extra hours or getting pushed around by campaign aides, he'd be furious on his behalf. Then he'd feel guilty. Then the spiral would start. Ethan had spent 3 years trying to keep his dad out of spirals, which is why when his supervisor cornered him in the storage room, he felt his jaw clench. "Bad news," she said. "Hale's team wants overnight staff in the building to run sound checks at 3 a.m. They said you're the only maintenance person cleared for after-hours keys." He blinked. "That's not my shift. They're paying overtime." He shook his head. "I can't. I need to take my dad to an appointment in the morning." She winced. "I get it, Ethan, I do. But they're insisting. I've got no one else." He felt a heat rise in his chest. Anger rare, but sharp. "My father can't wait in cold lobbies anymore. I told them I'd be here all afternoon. That's all I can do." She looked genuinely pained. "If you say no, they'll escalate it to the city coordinator, and you know how they get when they think someone's not being cooperative." A familiar dread settled under his ribs. He'd seen city coordinators torpedo contracts, redirect funding, and quietly blacklist workers who gave them trouble. And with his past, with his reputation, he had almost no cushion to fall on. He dragged a hand across his face. "Let me think." He paced the small room, anger and worry twisting together. He couldn't jeopardize his father's stability, couldn't jeopardize their apartment, couldn't jeopardize his job. But every part of him recoiled at the idea of bending again, at stepping back into a world where people with louder voices rewrote truth and consequences to suit themselves. When he didn't answer right away, his supervisor said softly, "I'm sorry, Ethan. I know it's unfair." Unfair didn't begin to describe it. He nodded once, heavy. "Tell them I'll be here." She sighed in relief and hurried off. Ethan stayed in the storage closet long after she left, gripping the metal shelf, eyes burning with something he hadn't let himself feel in a decade. He thought of his father struggling to stand. He thought of Lily getting barked at by grown adults who should know better. He thought of Nora's eyes the moment she saw him, how the truth had flickered there, dangerous and real. Pressure built in his chest like a storm brewing under skin. By the time he stepped back into the main hallway, the gym was alive with rehearsals. Microphones chirped. Volunteers scurried. Nora practiced her opening remarks with the precision of someone who'd built her world on airtight appearances. She didn't see him this time, but he saw her, and something in him, quiet for years, stirred like a warning. The night shift was going to be long. Unreasonably long, the kind that tests patience and dignity in equal measure. And by the time the clock struck 3 a.m., when he'd hauled cables-tested lights and endured 2 hours of instructions from people too self-important to say thank you, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Something was coming, something he couldn't outrun this time. And when it hit, it was going to change everything. By the time the night bled into early morning, Ethan's body felt hollowed out. He'd been awake nearly 22 hours, and each hour had carried one more demand from the campaign staff. The air inside the civic center had gone stale TV lights, humming overhead wires crisscrossing the floor like a nest of electric tension. Everything smelled of stress, too much coffee, fresh paint from the podium backdrop, and the raw metallic scent of equipment overheating. At 3:07 a.m., he was crouched behind the rows of chairs tightening a cable connection on a rented amplifier that kept crackling. One of the tech contractor's young guy, couldn't be older than 25, hovered behind him, impatient. "Dude, can you hurry?" the kid muttered. "We've got a senator on the way. We can't have embarrassing audio." Ethan didn't look up. "I'm moving as fast as I can. This cable's damaged. We'll fix it. The press arrives in 5 hours." Ethan swallowed the exhaustion burning behind his eyes. The kid didn't know him. Didn't know that once upon a time people trusted him with structures that held thousands of lives every day. Didn't know he'd lost everything: career, reputation, marriage, because the truth had been less convenient than the politics surrounding it. He tightened the final bolt. "There," he said quietly. The kid didn't thank him, just barked to someone across the gym. "We're good, finally." Ethan pushed himself up slowly, joints aching. The clock above the scoreboard blinked. 3:11. 4 more hours until sunrise. 6 more until the event. 8 until he could take his dad to the appointment. He rubbed the back of his neck. Just get through the night. He reached for the next item on his list, checking the power load on the main breaker. The lighting crew had added more equipment, too much in his opinion. He kept seeing the wattage in his head, adding, multiplying, estimating the strain. Old buildings like this one had quirks, unpredictable ones. As he approached the utility hallway, he saw Lily again. She was sitting on the floor beside a stack of tables, hugging her knees, jacket pulled tight. Her volunteer badge was still around her neck. "Lily," he whispered. Her head shot up, startled. "I'm fine," she said quickly. He crouched down beside her. "It's late. You were supposed to be done hours ago. They told me to stay because someone messed up the youth panel seating plan," she muttered. "But then the staff kept sending me away. And then they forgot I was here." She tried to sound tough, but her voice trembled on the edges. Ethan felt something twist in his chest. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded without looking at him. He found an unopened granola bar from his cart and handed it over. She took it with both hands as though it were something fragile. "Thank you." He nodded. "Sit here for a bit. I'll make sure they know you're leaving soon." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased. Ethan turned toward the breaker room. That's when the lights flickered. Not the small, normal kind of flicker. The whole building pulsed like the power grid had hiccuped. A low hum rattled the vents. Ethan froze. His instincts buried beneath 10 years of silence surged awake. Too much load. Too many circuits pulling too much current at once. And the storm outside was hammering the grid. He forced open the breaker room door. Heat blasted him. The main board was vibrating. One of the auxiliary breakers glowed faintly orange, overheating. "Damn it," he whispered. "This isn't stable." He reached to shut down the riser lights, but a sudden roar of static exploded from the gym, followed by shouting. Ethan sprinted toward the sound. When he burst into the gym, chaos had erupted. A row of lighting rigs on the left side had blown out sparks raining down like metallic fireflies. Volunteers screamed and scattered. One of the stands tilted dangerously, wobbling on its base. And at the center of the commotion, Lily. She had run toward the exploding lights instead of away, helping a cameraman who'd been knocked off balance. The rig buckled further, groaning like old steel under strain. Someone yelled, "Get away from that!" Another shouted, "It's going down!" The entire left scaffold tipped, screeching as it slid off its support. Ethan didn't think, didn't plan. A decade of buried knowledge snapped into perfect clarity. He ran. He reached the collapsing structure just as it gave its final lurch. Without hesitation, he wedged himself beneath the nearest support bar, bracing his shoulder under the metal frame. The weight slammed down. White-hot pain shot across his back. But the structure froze, held aloft by the strength of his stance and the leverage of the angled frame. "Get them out!" Ethan shouted through clenched teeth. "Move!" Two volunteers grabbed Lily, pulling her clear. Someone else dragged the cameraman. The rig buckled again, metal squealing like it was alive. "Go!" Ethan yelled. He wasn't sure if they heard him over the alarms blaring through the building. Flames flickered along the wires. Smoke curled from the vent at the base of the rig. His muscles shook. He couldn't hold it long. A memory cut through the roar, the bridge collapse. The moment he'd stood on a platform watching his design twist into disaster because someone else had changed the specs. The moment he'd realized truth wouldn't matter, not against the Hale family's political machine. A voice from 10 years ago echoed, "We trust the findings." He braced his feet, pushed harder. Not this time, not another collapse, not another person hurt because he stayed silent. He sucked in a breath and shifted his weight, using the remaining supports to brace the failing structure long enough for the last volunteer to drag a sound tech free of the debris. The moment Ethan saw people clear the danger zone, his strength faltered. The metal dropped an inch, then two, the sound deafening. He ducked, rolled onto the floor, and scrambled as the rig crashed down behind him, scattering sparks across the floor like shooting stars. The impact shook the room. Silence followed. Thick, electric, horrified. Smoke drifted upward. People stared. Then someone whispered, "He saved them." One of the volunteers, crying, nodded frantically. He held the whole thing up. He kept it from crushing them. Someone else breathed, "How the hell did he do that?" Ethan pushed to his knees, coughing. His back screamed. His palms were burned. But he was alive. And so was Lily. She broke free from the volunteers and ran to him, sobbing. "You're crazy," she cried, throwing her arms around him. "You're completely crazy." He winced, but hugged her back gently. "You okay?" She nodded fiercely into his shoulder. You saved me. You. Her voice cracked. He held her there until she calmed enough to breathe normally. When she pulled back, her eyes were red but defiant. Don't let them pretend you're invisible again. Ethan gave a tired, crooked smile. Let's hope they don't try. But when he looked up, he saw that half the campaign staff, including some of the very people who'd dismissed him, stood frozen watching him like they'd just seen something they didn't understand. Because they hadn't. Not yet. Then a voice cut through the crowd. Ethan. Nora. She stood near the stage steps, stunned, breathless face, pale beneath the glow of emergency lighting. She took a few steps forward but stopped short, as if unsure of her right to come any closer. What did you just do? She whispered. Her campaign manager answered for him, voice shaking. He stopped a full collapse. If he hadn't... He swallowed hard. We'd be calling ambulances right now. Nora's hand rose to her chest, trembling. She looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time, and also like she'd known this all along. Ethan wiped a smear of soot from his cheek. His breathing was steady again, but inside something wordless and old stirred something he thought he'd put in the ground with the ruins of his past career. It wasn't pride. It was relief. Relief that he still remembered how to protect people, how to act when it mattered, how to stand between danger and those who needed someone steady. But the consequences were immediate and unavoidable. Cameras from the press rehearsal had been recording. Half the gym had seen him step into that falling rig, and the other half, they'd just realized that the maintenance guy who moved chairs and carried caution signs had held up 1,000 pounds of collapsing steel long enough to save multiple lives. No one was looking past him now. Even the campaign staff, the ones who'd treated him like furniture, were whispering eyes cutting toward him with something like awe, or fear, or both. Nora walked slowly toward him. Are you hurt? She asked. He shook his head. Just tired. Her gaze softened, sorrow and amazement tangled in it. You didn't hesitate, she said quietly. Not for a second. He didn't answer. Because in that moment, surrounded by smoke and shaking volunteers and the wreckage of a disaster he'd prevented, he finally understood something. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. And the truth, the whole truth, was coming for both of them. For several long seconds after the lighting rig crashed, no one moved. The alarms quieted, the sparks died, but the silence grew louder, thick enough to feel on the skin. Smoke drifted upward in thin gray ribbons, the only motion in a gym full of stunned people. Ethan stayed kneeling on the floor, one hand braced against it, waiting for the spinning in his head to settle. His back throbbed, his arms shook, and the taste of metal lingered in the back of his throat. But everyone was alive. Lily, the cameraman, the volunteers who'd frozen like deer in a highway spotlight. He breathed, just one slow breath, then another. Someone get him water, a tech muttered, his voice shaky. A volunteer rushed forward with a bottle, hands trembling as she passed it to him like he was something sacred. Others kept their distance, staring with a mix of fear and reverence, as though the maintenance guy they'd ignored all week had just revealed a superhuman trick. Nora stood a few feet away, one hand over her mouth, the other pressed to her heart, as if to hold it steady. She looked at him the way she'd looked when she first saw him at the back of that rally weeks earlier, like the past had stepped straight out of a box she'd buried deep. He pushed himself to his feet. The gym lights flickered again, but finally steadied. A half circle formed around him, people afraid to blink. Lily was the first to speak. "He saved us," she said, voice cracking. He held it up. He held the whole thing up. The words broke the spell. One of the cameramen whispered, "How did he do that?" A lighting technician murmured, "That structure weighs, God, I don't even know." Someone else asked, "Who is this guy?" Ethan almost laughed at the absurdity, but the weight of Lily's trembling hand still clinging to his sleeve brought him back. "Let's check the injured first," he said quietly. He moved toward the cameraman who'd fallen, but a staffer stepped in front of him. No, you shouldn't move," she stammered. "We should call paramedics for you." "I'm fine," he said. "No, seriously, you're back," I said. "I'm fine." The force in his voice startled even him. The staffer backed up as though she'd touched a live wire. A small cluster of volunteers helped the injured cameraman to a chair. Nothing too serious. Cuts, bruises, a sprain maybe. The medic on site checked him over. Meanwhile, Lily wouldn't let go of Ethan's sleeve. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered again. "You shouldn't have risked that much." "I couldn't let it fall," he said simply. She wiped tears with her sleeve. "You could have died." Ethan touched her shoulder gently. "You're safe. That's what matters." Her chin crumpled, and she hugged him again. It hurt, his ribs protested, but he didn't let her see that. He held her steady until she let go. Only then did Ethan become aware of the hush around him. Everyone watching. Everyone waiting. And Nora. She stepped toward him slowly, like she was approaching something fragile and powerful at the same time. "Ethan," she said softly, "you need to come with me." He frowned. "Why?" "Because we need to talk. And because..." She glanced behind her at the scorched rig and the cluster of horrified staffers. This changes everything. He didn't want to follow her. His back hurt. His nerves buzzed. But he also knew that whatever came next wouldn't wait. She led him down the hallway toward a small conference room where the press team had been working overnight. Her campaign manager, Julian Brandt, followed them, face, pale eyes wide. Nora shut the door behind them. "What the hell just happened?" Julian said, pacing. "That rig should have killed at least 2 people. You held it up. You physically held it up." Ethan remained silent. Julian turned to Nora. "Did you know about this?" "Know what?" she asked. "That he..." Julian threw his hands up. Apparently has the upper body strength of a forklift and the instincts of a structural engineer. Nora didn't answer. She just looked at Ethan, waiting for him to speak. He could have lied. Could have shrugged and said adrenaline. Could have claimed luck. But he was tired of lying by omission. Tired of letting the world mislabel him. So he said quietly, "I was a bridge engineer." Julian froze mid-pace. "A what?" 10 years ago, Ethan continued. "I worked for the Lake Erie Infrastructure Commission, designed load-bearing structures across 3 counties. Nora inhaled sharply. "Ethan." He lifted a hand. "Let me finish." He looked at Julian. "You ever wonder why someone like me works maintenance? Why I carry mops instead of blueprints?" Julian nodded slowly. The background check said you had a license issue. Something about the Bayshore collapse," Ethan said. Nora winced. Julian's jaw dropped. "You mean the one that killed those 3 workers?" Ethan finished. "Yeah." Julian swallowed. But the investigation blamed a design flaw. "It wasn't my flaw," Ethan said, "but the man responsible was connected to the Hale family's political donors, and pointing fingers the right way would have tanked their re-election campaigns." Nora closed her eyes. I signed the settlement paperwork, Ethan said. Took the fall. Lost my license, my job, my career. And after that? No one in the state would hire me for anything but janitorial work. Julian stared at him like he'd just confessed to being a fugitive or revealed a lost identity. Why would you take the fall for something that wasn't your fault? Ethan looked at Nora. Her breath hitched. Julian's eyes widened again. Oh my God, you knew him then? Nora nodded barely. You knew what they did to him, Julian said, voice trembling with outrage. And you didn't. He didn't force me, Ethan cut in. I signed because I thought I could protect everyone. And because I was young and stupid. Julian stepped back, running a hand through his hair. We have a problem. Which is, Ethan asked. Julian jabbed a finger toward the hallway. Half the press rehearsal cameras were recording. They caught you running into that collapse. If footage gets out showing you perform something that takes expert-level structural knowledge plus the strength to hold a steel rig, they're going to ask why a maintenance guy reacted like a crisis engineer. Nora leaned forward. And when they do ask, everything you just said your past will come into the light. The truth hit the room with the weight of steel plates settling. Julian whispered, this could torpedo her campaign. Investigations, old settlements reopened, lawsuits, media scrutiny, opposition digging through the past. He stopped pacing. But he looked at Ethan again. This could also save her campaign, he said. If we get ahead of it. Ethan blinked. How Julian stepped closer. Because you didn't just save those volunteers. You saved us. This morning's town hall includes live press coverage from every major station in Ohio. And right now, our biggest problem is a narrative that says Nora Hale is too polished, too rehearsed, too privileged to understand everyday people. He gestured toward the gym. And then our working-class maintenance worker turns out to be the guy who held up a collapsed rig and saved folks. A man who was wronged by the very system she's promising to reform. Nora flinched. Julian's voice softened. Ethan, you could redefine everything about this campaign. Ethan stared at him. By becoming a political prop, Julian opened his mouth, but Nora intervened, voice steady. No, not a prop. She looked at Ethan, a partner in truth. He exhaled sharply as though struck. She stepped closer. I should have defended you 10 years ago, she said, eyes glassy. I let others tell me what protecting the greater good meant, and I abandoned the person who actually stood for it. Ethan looked away. I can't rewrite the past, Nora continued, but I can stop running from it. And from you. And from the truth of what happened. Julian muttered. We should prep a statement. If we move fast, we can control the narrative before the press gets wind of. Nora raised a hand, silencing him. This isn't about the campaign, she said quietly. Then she turned back to Ethan. It's about us. He swallowed hard. She took another step close enough that he could see the tremor in her hands. I've been carrying the guilt of what happened for 10 years, she whispered. Every bridge I promised to build, every speech about accountability. I never said the one thing that mattered. He stared at her heartbeat, loud in his ears. I never told the truth about you. The room felt too small, too bright. Julian cleared his throat. Well, if you two are going to lay your souls bare, I'm going to go check on the fire marshal and make sure no one dies again today. He slipped out and shut the door behind him. Silence. Ethan leaned against the table, exhausted. Why now, he asked softly. Why come clean after all these years? Her answer was immediate. Because when I watched you run toward that collapse, I realized I'd spent a decade building a public life on courage while you lived a private life practicing it. She stepped even closer. And because I'm done pretending you're someone I outgrew. His breath caught. But before he could respond, Julian burst back into the room, breathless. "You're going to want to hear this," he said. "The fire marshal and 3 volunteers are already telling reporters what they saw. Your name is spreading through the building like wildfire." He pointed toward the gym. "Ethan, they want you out there." Ethan blinked. "Why?" "Because Julian said they think you saved their lives, and they want to thank you before the whole crowd arrives." Nora touched Ethan's hand, hesitant, trembling, afraid he might pull away. "You don't have to speak," she said softly. "But you deserve to be seen." He looked between them, the woman he once trusted, the truth that had cost him everything, and the possibility of something new rising out of the ruins. A moment he never expected. A moment that changed the power dynamic completely. He straightened slowly, wincing at the ache in his back. "Let's go," he said. Nora exhaled relief, fear, something tender. Julian sprinted ahead to alert staff. And as Ethan stepped toward the hallway, toward the lights, toward the people waiting to meet the man they'd underestimated, a new understanding settled over him. This wasn't just about a collapsed rig, or a past injustice, or even Nora. It was the start of something bigger. A chance to reclaim the life he lost and decide what he wanted next. Whatever happened in that gym, it would define everything that came after. When Ethan stepped back into the gym, the atmosphere had shifted from stunned silence to a kind of reverent hush. Volunteers formed a loose half-circle around him, murmuring words of thanks that felt awkward on their tongues, like they weren't sure they had the right to say them. People who'd waved him off an hour earlier now stood with hands folded, heads lowered, faces soft with humility. Lily stayed close, eyes still red but shining now with something warmer than fear. The cameraman he'd saved limped toward him with an ice pack taped to his ankle and held out a shaky hand. "You didn't have to do what you did," he said. "But I'm damn grateful you did." Ethan took the handshake gentle so he wouldn't jostle the man's injuries. Then the fire marshal approached, stern. Gray-bearded, the kind of man who'd spent decades teaching people to respect things that fall and burn. "You kept that structure from dropping full force," he said. "Most men wouldn't even try. You saved lives tonight, son." Ethan blinked. It had been a long time since anyone had called him son, without disappointment or exhaustion in their voice. Reporters had arrived earlier than expected, drawn by the commotion. They clustered at the edges of the gym, now cameras lowered out of respect. Not pushed into his face like they did with public figures, but angled downward, waiting for an invitation he hadn't given. Nora stepped beside him. "One moment, please," she said to the reporters. "Let him breathe." Surprisingly, they obeyed. He tried to step aside, let her take the spotlight the way she'd trained for her whole life, but she shook her head. "You stood between people and danger," she whispered. "Let them see what that looks like." He swallowed hard. After everything that had happened, everything they had been, those words landed deeper than applause ever could. Julian cleared his throat and addressed the reporters. "Ladies and gentlemen, before today's town hall begins, there's something you need to hear." Ethan stiffened. "Julian, don't turn this into..." But Julian raised both hands. "This isn't spin, it's gratitude." He gestured toward the damaged rig. "That collapse should have been a tragedy. It wasn't because Ethan Cole, our maintenance supervisor, stepped in when everyone else froze." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not." But Nora touched his arm, not forcefully, just enough to tell him she wasn't letting him shrink away. The cameras lifted. A volunteer near the front broke the silence. He didn't even think. He just ran. Another added, "If he hadn't held that thing, I'd be in a hospital bed." Someone else said, "Or a grave." Ethan stared down at the scuffed floor. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to do the right thing. Nora finally stepped forward to speak. "Ethan Cole saved lives today," she said, voice steady. Not because he wanted attention, not because he needed praise, but because when he saw danger, he moved toward it. She paused, letting her next words settle. "That's what real leadership looks like. And that's the kind of courage I want Ohio to stand behind." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. The same staffers who had barked orders at him earlier now approached with apologies. Awkward, quiet, earnest. One young volunteer nearly burst into tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We treated you like you didn't matter." He didn't scold them, didn't gloat, just nodded once. "We're all tired. We all make mistakes. Just be kinder next time." The room softened. And by the time the town hall actually began, Ethan had become an unintentional centerpiece. Not the star he didn't want that, but the steady presence people glanced at with newfound respect. By the afternoon, word was already spreading beyond the civic center. Clips from security cameras leaked. Local news ran a segment titled, "Maintenance Worker Prevents Disaster." The fire marshal vouched for his bravery on record. Lily's mother hugged him so tightly he worried she'd crack a rib. For once, his name wasn't followed by blame. For once, the truth didn't hurt him. By the end of the week, the city offered him a reinstatement hearing for his engineering license. By the end of the month, Nora asked him not as a favor, not for optics, to advise her campaign on infrastructure reform. "You don't have to be on stage," she said. "Just help me do this right." And he agreed. Not for politics, for integrity. For the chance to fix the things he once knew how to build. For himself. 3 months later, Ethan sat on the back deck of the small ranch house he'd rented on the west side of town. His dad sat beside him, legs propped on a stool, sipping iced tea, and pretending he didn't get misty-eyed every time he mentioned the words "reinstated license." Lily came by every few days for homework help. Her grades had shot up confidence too. And Nora. She stopped by with coffee twice a week, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to sit in comfortable silence, sometimes to walk with him along the lake where they'd once dreamed of things too big for who they were then. They didn't pretend the past had been easy. They didn't rush anything. But something steady had returned, a trust that had been broken but not destroyed. One quiet evening, as they watched the sun melt into Lake Erie, Nora said softly, "You know, the day I saw you holding that rig, something in me shifted. I realized the world measures strength all wrong." Ethan smiled faintly. "How's that?" "It sees strength as loud," she said. "But real strength is quiet. It's steady. It's the person who carries weight without needing applause." He looked out at the water. "I think you're learning that too," he murmured. She nodded. And for once they didn't need more words than that. In the months that followed, the Civic Center recognized Ethan in a small ceremony. Nothing flashy, just a wooden plaque, a handshake, and a room full of people who'd once overlooked him, now standing to applaud. He didn't want the attention, but the moment mattered. It didn't rewrite the past, but it reframed it. He wasn't the man who'd fallen. He was the man who'd stood up again, and stayed standing, long after everyone else went home. They say life doesn't hand out fair second chances. Maybe that's true. But sometimes, every once in a while, it hands out a moment where a person can choose who they'll become next. Ethan Cole chose quietly. He chose courage. He chose truth. And in doing so, he found something better than redemption. He found himself again. And if you ask anyone who was in that gym the night the lights fell, they'll tell you the same thing. Real heroes don't always hold microphones. Sometimes they hold up the world when it matters most.